Newcastle.
Well, two women on opposite sides of the world have resigned from politics recently. The first was Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, that impressive woman that Alan Jones wanted to strangle. You remember her? And the second was Nicola Sturgeon, who was the First Minister for Scotland. They have very similar resignation speeches. Both talked about the personal toll of leadership, the long hours, the lack of privacy, time away from family, and, of course, the human cost of doing that job. Now, obviously, things have improved for women in politics, or at least we hope they have. We'll find out in just a moment. But, it does seem like there's still a lot of work to be done. Sharon Claydon is the federal member for Newcastle. She was elected in 2013. Prior to that, she was a local councillor between 2008 and 2012. She's been in the game for quite a while, and she's been good enough to come in and reflect on that journey and experience. Sharon Claydon, good morning.
Morning, Paul, and happy Monday to all your listeners.
Deputy Speaker of the House, you run the show in the Federation Chamber and step up around question time when you're required to do so. That was part of the appointment of the Albanese government, of course, that you were elevated to that position. Can you tell us firstly how you found that?
I love it. I have to thank the Prime Minister, actually, for he encouraged me probably 8 years ago now to put my name forward to join the Speakers panel when I was in opposition, and I found it really invaluable. It's learning the craft of being a parliamentarian as opposed to a politician. And I think learning rules and processes and procedures enables you to be a much better politician. And trying to enforce those rules is part of the challenge.
I'll try and be on my best behaviour. I don't want to get ejected from the studio in the next 10 minutes. What's it like being a woman in politics? Is it harder than being a man, do you think?
Well, I've never been a man, of course, but I do think that there are specific challenges for women in politics. And I think your reference to the two quite extraordinary speeches we heard from Jacinda Ardern and Nicola Sturgeon recently highlight some of those very unique challenges for women. And it's not that there isn't levels of pressure that exist on anyone in sort of public office. That, of course, happens. But we know when it comes to things like the level of abuse being experienced, that for women in politics and in public life, it is there's a level of intensity that increases, and it's often sexualised in its nature. Yep. And so that makes it...
this is stuff in the corridors, not necessarily...
It's online, it's in the corridors, it's in public spaces, it's in a lot of surprising places, to be honest. People find... thankfully, I think there are a minority of people, but people feel the need to tell you some extraordinary things from time to time. And everybody in public life has a level of thick skin. I've got no doubt about that. But I think having women in leadership positions is showing us a different style of leadership that's possible as well.
Because there's a lot at stake here, right? Because the notion of eliminating, putting the battle of the sexes aside for a moment, eliminating 50% of your population means that you're drawing on a smaller pool of great candidates. I mean, it's just silly, isn't it?
It's like every workplace, you want to have the best people there, but for a parliament, you also want it to reflect your community. And the idea of, not having 50% of your community represented in a parliament is just a nonsense. So,
is this structural? I mean, are there stuff that you'd look at and you'd say, if you got rid of that, that, and that, then the interest of female politicians would rise exponentially?
Absolutely. So each of the political parties have a role to play in the way that they pre-select candidates. The Australian Labor Party, which I belong to, 30 years ago started that journey. So I am really proud to be in the first female majority government ever in Australia. We are 52% of the Australian Labor Party caucus room. So other parties need to have a look at that. Yes. And think about, what works within their structures to enable a proper representation of women, but also now diversity within those ranks as well. And that's really the challenge that we've confronted, making sure we've got good First Nations representation, people of all faiths, and, women of colour. So that's been, because that's what our community looks like. I'd never
So why
forget.
is it? Because when you went into council 15 years ago, you weren't a novelty. I mean, why is there distinction?
Well, I
between...
was a bit. There was only 2 women on council when I was elected, and it's the current Lord Mayor and myself. That was it, out of 13. So, and one of the first acts that council tried to do was to remove the assistance on childcare that was provided to enable a councillor to attend evening meetings. So, I've reflected often on that, and that's part of the reason why you've got to have women sitting at the table in every decision-making process, whether it's local government, state or federal. And there are changes. You're right. I mean, part of my job as Deputy Speaker, I've taken on responsibility for the implementation of Kate Jenkins' recommendations in helping shape what that looks like in practice for the Parliament. So just last week, the Parliament has endorsed the codes of conduct that I drafted as chair of a committee, which sets out standards of behaviour, what we would expect from our politicians, from everyone who works in a Commonwealth parliamentary workplace.
Mm. It's a bit of a running joke in politics, isn't it? You know, it's like if someone gets on the terps, they're described as being emotional, tired and emotional. And then, of course, if once the game is up and you've got to move on, it's to spend more time with the family. Ironically, if you're able to spend more time with the family earlier, wouldn't politics be a better place? But it's in encouraging women, it's not as simplistic as putting a creche into Parliament House, is it? You know.
No, and we do have a childcare centre. We replaced the bar with a childcare centre, a great repurposing.
So no one can get tired and emotional anymore.
A great repurposing of Commonwealth assets, and that was a really important step for the Parliament. Look, I think what women leaders around the world have showed us, and there is diversity amongst them, and they come from all kinds of, all parts of the political spectrum, is that there are ways, I think, rather than seeing it as a vulnerability, but understanding that, empathy. I think Jacinda Ardern showed us how an empathetic kind of leadership can be not only effective, but something that people relate very strongly to. And I don't think there's a person in Australia that wouldn't recall that moment following the atrocious massacre at the mosque in Christchurch, her role and how she led the nation and the world, I think, in responding to a terrorist attack. It was a very different kind of way to respond, but super effective and really, really powerful. So, Parliament, when I'm chairing Parliament, it's a very loud, boisterous, chest-beating, masculine environment. And, people... that can often escalate the sorts of behaviours that you actually don't want. And it's what most Australian people complain to me about, to be honest, is just, why are people so badly behaved in question time?
But some of the women give as good as they get in that environment, don't they?
And because we are all growing up and learning bad behaviours from that environment we're in. But there are, I'm working with the Speaker and the President of the Senate looking at sort of ways that we reform our standing orders, which are the rules of the Parliament, because these codes of practice and the standards of behaviour that we're trying to change as a result of some pretty horrific behaviours in Parliament that were made abundantly clear by the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Kate Jenkins, in her report, we've got to... there is a real appetite and need for change now. We're making the structural change, but you need to embed that in people's everyday practice. And that's the long, hard work. I'm doing the law reform aspects of it now, but really I know that the hard work is changing the culture, and you need more and more women into that Parliament for that to happen.
Sharon Claydon, can you say, or could you say hand on heart to the young women in your life that this is a great job and I'd love to see you do it?
Absolutely. I see young women all the time that are playing fantastic roles in our community that I really want to encourage to sort of step up. There are, I now, as I said, I belong to a party room with 52% women. The profound changes that has made gives me great confidence to encourage others to come through. And I think that no community can afford to chop out 50% of its population because you don't deliver the very best from your, elected body if you've only got a portion of the community represented in there. And I just think that there are lots of women who've got a lot to offer. What we need to ensure is that we have safe and respectful workplaces for them, wherever that might be. That's what I'm trying to ensure happens in the Commonwealth Parliament. If nothing else, I want my legacy to be establishing very clear guidelines to deliver safe, respectful workplaces in every Commonwealth workplace in Australia.
We're lucky to catch you on a day when Parliament isn't sitting, so you're back in the electorate office. What's the day in the life when you're in the office?
Well, I just had the most fantastic weekend, which was not my office is out in the community, so to speak. There were lots of great events. We, celebrated local manufacturing with the independent brewers in King Edward Park. There was the brilliant World Pride dinner, the pink salt dinner on Saturday night, that even though the rain pelted down and washed out the dessert, I really felt for our local Master Chef Reese, who didn't get to get up on stage and talk about his role, I guess, in our community and what he wanted to see change.
Yeah, it was terrible. The tellies are ruined too, apparently. Sharon Claydon.